Hello! The aim of this presentation is to introduce a resource that was adapted for a lesson with the purpose to improve the pupil's learning. The objectives of this presentation are to provide a rationale behind my resource. Secondly, to critically review and analyze my resource with reference to subject-specific and broad range of academic reading. Third, to critically reflect and evaluate on how has my resource improved pupils' learning, and lastly, a consideration on how my resource could be developed. A sentence builder is a way to group vocabulary and grammar in chunks, with the aim to introduce a unit to the pupils in a simple way. The resource I used was a sentence builder that I presented to my years and pupils whilst talking about the topic of ciudades. The theory behind the sentence builders comes from Dr. Conti's mass ES theory. Dr. Conti has not invented sentence builders. The first sentence builders found come from 16th century France. Dr. Conti's mass ES theory comes under the umbrella of the communicative language teaching. This theory claims that language is acquired through communication. The belief that communicative confidence only develops if students are required to do activities which require real-life communication. The weak form of the approach sees communicative activities as opportunities for the students to practice a new language and develop fluency. Communicative language teaching provides opportunities for students to not focus only on the language, but also on the learning process itself. The claim is that second language acquisition is learned best when students try to communicate. The mass ears theory is an acronym formed by several acronyms. M stands for modeling. This is presented through chunks and patterns of vocabulary, generally presented as sentence builders. According to Dr. Conte's theories, sentence builders are great to teach lexical and syntactic patterns in context, and they allow to model chunks and patterns through listening and reading. They are also a fantastic way to recycle old material and to plant the seed of new linguistic items. This is through the form of high expectations. A stands for awareness. The grammar is presented as pop-up grammar. This means the explanation is not a lengthy one and is appropriate to the age and content they need to learn according to the curriculum and scheme of work. R stands for receptive processing. This is where students are given exercise where those chunks on the sentence builder are repeated throughout engaging reading and listening activities where language is modeled and the same vocabulary and grammar structures are constantly repeated. Long-term memory is increased when learning time is devoted to consciously retrieving the information to be remembered. Scaffolding is available throughout this phase. S stands for structured production. On this phase, the student provides intensively scaffolded and highly controlled production. This includes highly controlled tasks such as translation exercises, where the student can practice their production with a great variety of chunks while recycling old material, indenting it on their long-term memory. Teacher has total control of the outcome of these activities, and in this phase there's still a high level of scaffolding. E stands for expansion. Two things happen during this phase. First, the students are taught to make sense of the pattern and chunk constructions, meaning that here is where the in-depth grammar lesson is introduced. This is because it's easier for the students to remember since they have been exposed to the grammar through relentless exposure and use. Learning grammar by deconstructing chunks that one has been using over and over is much easier than learning it from a decontextualized PowerPoint or grammar book. The second thing that happens is that the target chunks need to be constantly recycled with new and old vocabulary, and this is so important for fluency since memory is context dependent, meaning that learning grammar on a context of vocabulary, for example holidays, does not mean that the student will be able to apply it to other contexts without practicing. Scaffolding might be necessary during this phase. A stands for autonomy. This is the phase where end of the unit assessments are done. Dr. Conti recommends not to tell the students that there will be a test, and the aim of this is to see if the scaffolding can be removed and the students are able to use the language on their own. The material will still be reviewed and recycled to ensure that it is indented in the long-term memories all across the 4 skills where possible. Dr. Conti created the Conti matrix, and we will see this on the next slide. As you can see on this slide, Dr. Conti created the Conti matrix, where each unit of work is divided on 5 subunits. In each of the first 4 subunits, the teacher will stage the mass cycle for each target item. In Unit 5, the teacher will focus solely on fluency and spontaneity, which will be done through recycling. R stands for routinization. This phase focuses on recycling materials throughout the year and previous years through activities that promote speed of retrieval and automatization. S stands for spontaneity. This phase occurs at the end of a unit and recycles through the subsequent units in the years to come through carefully planned recycle. This phase is to be staged into the final weeks of each term, and Dr. Conti recommends to allocate 6 to 8 full lessons to this. Dr. Conti insists that constant recycling is the key to fluency, as this chart represents. This chart represents all the steps that are to be repeated and recycled to achieve progress with the students. As you can see in this slide, the sentence builder I created for Year 10 has the vocabulary for them to be able to describe their town. This resource was introduced in the lesson number 3 of 7 in the sequence of lessons. Some vocabulary had already been introduced about towns, and we had already touched some grammar. My aim for them with the sentence builder was to be able to guide them through the writing activity that we were meant to do during the lesson, but since we did not have time, they got the writing task as their homework. The way I introduced the sentence builder to them was through a listening and modeling exercise where all the vocabulary was explained to them, and afterwards we modeled it to avoid misconceptions on pronunciation, and after that we translated it to language 1. We used it to do a fill the gap exercise, and afterwards they got the opportunity to use it as a guide for their homework. Also, I used it as an opportunity to introduce the difference between se puede and se pueden, which we had to address later with other common misconceptions that I found while assessing their homework. During the weekly mentor meeting, we talked about the lesson and the feedback of the lesson. The teacher mentor praised my sequencing and cultural awareness input. We talked about improvements in behavior management through my inspiring tasks and activities. There were several points that needed improvement, like the speed of the audio recordings, as some of the students struggled with the speed. Another thing that was mentioned was to add some translations to the sentence builder, since the students had not seen some of the vocabulary yet. I did, however, successfully model for them afterwards while doing a faulty translation. As I had planned the writing task to be done during the lesson and not as homework, we mentioned that I should allow around 50% of the lesson if I was going to allow the students to have time to work on it. Also, it was mentioned that my starters should be shortened and the pace should be improved. The work produced by the students following the sentence builder. I assessed their books formatively. That is what I use to address the misconceptions both on their vocabulary and grammar in future lessons, and I gave them feedback with what went well and even better if. The production of the text was structured as they followed the sentence builder, and it was highly controlled still. However, the students were successful in writing a text and made progress. There is several ways that I could use to improve my resource. The first one is putting the resource inside boxes to fit better with the image of a sentence builder, since my resource was more structured as bullet points than the form of the image that we have in our heads of a sentence builder. Secondly, I will introduce more vocabulary and complex structures. This is to implement the idea of high expectations. I would also have introduced it earlier during the sequence of lessons, and we should have worked on the mass phase before asking them to produce a work that should have been unaided. While after this lesson I did return to the vocabulary learned in the sentence builder through retrieval practice on the rest of the lessons of the sequence, and I also addressed grammar misconceptions that I had seen in their books after assessing them, I feel like the resource was rushed and there was so many more activities that we could have done to implement the mass ears technique and work on their spontaneity. Scaffolding could have been better implemented. Overall, I am satisfied with the students' work using the resource, and after doing all my research, I would probably have done some things different. I am proud that the students were able to produce some work, even if it was structured and not spontaneous. These are some references that were used to create this presentation. Thank you for watching the presentation.